I was halfway across the parking lot when I saw someone standing at my car, and by the time I recognized what I was looking at, it felt too late to turn around without making it obvious. They were beside the driver's door with their hand close to the handle, positioned like they had just tested it or were about to. When I got closer, they didn't walk away. They shifted their stance instead, almost like they were adjusting their angle while they watched me approach. I'd stayed late at the store that night, and by the time I locked up, most of the lot had cleared out. My car was a few rows out, parked nose first in a spot that always felt farther away at night than it did during the day. I slowed down just enough to take in what I was seeing. They weren't looking at me yet. They kept their focus on the car, almost like they were still debating something. When I got close enough, they finally glanced up. They stepped back a little, not to give me space, but as if they were shifting into a new position. I unlocked the car with the remote and got in quickly. I locked the doors, started the engine, and kept one hand on the gear shift while watching them through the windshield. They didn't look confused or in the wrong place. They looked like they were there on purpose. I eased the car out of the spot, careful not to hit the vehicle beside me. Before I could clear the space, they moved into the aisle behind me and blocked the path out. They weren't touching the car, but they stood close enough that I couldn't reverse without risking hitting them. I stepped on the brake pedal, hoping the lights would make them step aside. They didn't react in any way that made sense. Their posture didn't change, and they didn't try to communicate or explain themselves. They just stayed there. All I could think about was how planted they looked behind me. Backing out wasn't an option, and sitting still made it feel like I was giving them time to decide what happened next. The only clear route was forward, back into the spot and over the low curb ahead. I turned the wheel and eased the car forward. The tires climbed the curb, and for a moment I wondered if I might get stuck on top of it. The front wheels found the pavement on the other side, and the rest of the car followed with a small jolt. As the car angled past them, they moved toward the passenger side and reached for the handle in one quick motion. The handle jerked against the lock. For a second, I worried I'd forgotten to lock the doors and that they might actually get it open. The lock held, and their hands slid away as the car continued moving forward. I focused on getting to the lot exit and out onto the street instead of checking the mirror too soon. When I finally looked back, they weren't walking anymore. They stood near the edge of the lot, facing the direction I'd driven, not making any move to follow. I kept driving until the store was well behind me, and I didn't feel myself breathe normally again until I was several streets away. When I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, the quiet inside the car settled around me in a way that made it difficult to open the door right away. I didn't sleep much that night. What kept replaying wasn't the whole encounter, it was their hand on the passenger side handle and the sound of it straining against the lock. The next morning, I told my manager what happened. She listened closely and started a formal report before I finished. She arranged for someone to walk me out for the next few nights so I wouldn't have to leave alone. When she asked me to describe the person, she said she thought she knew who I meant. She'd noticed someone like that near the store earlier in the week, usually around closing, standing outside by the windows and watching the parking lot. She'd assumed they were waiting for someone. Now, she wasn't so sure. At one point, she looked toward the front of the store like she half expected to see someone standing there. A moment later, she said she was rearranging some schedules so I wouldn't have to close by myself for a while. The conversation unsettled me even more. I kept thinking about the possibility that the person might have been there on other nights before I ever noticed, standing near the windows, watching the lot, keeping track of who left and when. On my next closing shift, even with a coworker walking out with me, the parking lot felt different. I paid attention to anyone who wasn't heading to a car or going toward the stores. Anyone who stayed still when most of the lot was empty caught my attention, especially if they seemed more focused on the timing of others than on leaving themselves. Nothing else happened after that night, but I still think about them standing at my car when I came out, and the way they reached for the passenger side handle without hesitating. I look at parking lots differently now. Sometimes I see people standing near cars that aren't theirs, and I find myself wondering whether they're waiting for someone who stayed late, the same way that person seemed to be waiting for me. I was 3 floors down the stairwell when I realized the footsteps behind me were adjusting to match mine, speeding up when I moved faster and settling back when I slowed. It didn't feel like coincidence. When I tried one of the floor doors, the handle didn't move. It was locked. I hadn't noticed him at first. I'd stepped into the stairwell from my office floor and let the heavy door close behind me as I started down. It was late enough that most people had already left, and I was tired enough that taking the stairs felt quicker than waiting for the elevator. A few seconds later, the door above opened again. When I glanced up through the center of the stairwell, I saw someone step onto the landing and start coming down too. Nothing unusual at first, just another person leaving for the night. After another flight or two, he kept the same distance behind me, holding that exact spot like he'd settled into it on purpose. I tried a slightly quicker pace. The footsteps behind me shifted just enough to keep the distance the same. The sound wasn't loud, but the stairwell's echo made every adjustment stand out. A tight feeling settled in my stomach. Stopping on a landing and letting him pass didn't feel like an option. The space felt too narrow, and standing still with someone approaching from above didn't sit well. Turning around to make eye contact in the center of that tall, echoing stairwell felt worse. When I reached the next landing, I stepped toward the door for my usual exit level. The handle stayed firm. A temporary sign above the lock explained that re-entry from the stairwell was restricted during renovations and only allowed on certain floors. I let go of the handle and went back to the stairs before he reached the landing. I focused on getting to the ground floor. The stairwell was quiet except for our footsteps, and that quiet made the spacing between them feel sharper. A moment later, there was a brief break in the rhythm behind me, just long enough for me to register it, followed by a pair of quicker steps. It sounded like he had skipped a stair or two. By the last flight, he wasn't far behind anymore. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the next landing and stayed in motion. When I reached the bottom floor, I pushed the exit door open and stepped into the hallway. Before it could close fully behind me, a hand reached past my shoulder from behind and caught the edge of the door. The movement was quick, close enough that I felt the air shift beside my face before his hand settled on the metal. I stepped into the hallway, and a moment later he followed through behind me. He didn't acknowledge me or slow down. He just kept walking toward the side exit with the same steady pace, as if staying close in the stairwell had been the point all along. I went straight to the security desk. The guard understood something was wrong the moment he saw me. He asked for a description and wrote a few things down while he went over what they'd be checking on the cameras, telling me to report it if I ever saw the man anywhere else in the building. The next morning, I told a coworker what had happened. She paused the moment I mentioned the stairwell. She said she'd gone through almost the exact same thing a month earlier, walking down the same long stretch of stairs with footsteps behind her that stayed at the same distance and adjusted whenever she changed her pace. He stayed close enough that she couldn't ignore him, holding that distance in a way that made her uncomfortable without ever giving her a clear reason to call it a threat. She'd gone to the security desk too. They said they'd watch for him, but since he worked in the building and hadn't broken any rules, there wasn't much they could do unless he confronted someone. She stopped using the stairs after that. I still use them sometimes, but not without listening first. Even when no one is behind me, I catch myself paying attention to the pattern of my own steps, waiting for the faint shift of another pair falling into place behind mine. The man at the far end of the store motioned for me to come into the back aisle. He did that little "come here" thing with his hand and waited. He didn't look rushed or confused, and the way he held the movement made it clear he expected me to follow him. The moment I saw it, I felt something wasn't right. I stayed at the counter and kept my voice steady as I said I could help from where I was. He held the motion for another second before letting his hand fall and disappearing between the shelves. The last hour before closing was usually slow, with people coming in for a few things and heading straight out again. After that moment, though, the store felt different. The cooler hum seemed louder, and I caught myself checking the front doors more often than usual. A minute went by with the aisles staying completely quiet. I didn't hear any of the small sounds that usually come from someone browsing. Then he reappeared from a different aisle where the camera coverage wasn't great. He stopped halfway down and watched me for a moment before doing that little "come here" thing again. I stayed at the counter and repeated that I could help from there. He held the movement for a moment, let it drop, and drifted toward the refrigerated section. Nothing about his movements matched someone looking for products. He stopped in places that didn't line up with any shelves and kept his eyes on the cooler doors so he could watch my reflection. 5 minutes before closing, he walked toward the staff-only line on the floor. It was just a printed stripe, but everyone knew not to cross it. He slowed as he reached it, stepped 1 foot over while keeping the other behind, like he was testing how far he could go. I announced that we'd be closing soon. He looked right at me for a second, then pulled his foot back behind the line. He stayed near the edge of it, and neither of us moved much. I kept my hands busy behind the counter and he stood facing the front of the store while keeping some part of his focus on me. When closing time came, I followed my usual routine. I locked the doors, flipped the sign, and kept my movements steady. He hadn't picked anything up, and he didn't bring anything over. He walked toward the entrance, and once I locked the door behind him, he stepped outside. He stopped directly in front of the glass doors. Not pressed against them, but close enough that I could see him clearly. He just stood there, watching me, like he was waiting for something. I stayed behind the counter and kept moving, adjusting things that barely needed it and wiping down areas that were already clean. I didn't want to look frozen or turn my back on the doors for too long. After a little while, I walked into the back room, hoping he'd lose interest and head out. When I returned, he was still standing in the same place with the same posture. Eventually, he walked out of view to the right. I didn't see him pass the side windows or hear a car door or an engine. The lot looked normal from where I stood, but there were angles I couldn't see. When it was finally time to leave, I waited longer than usual before unlocking the door. I stepped out, walked straight to my car, got in, locked the doors, and pulled out of the lot without stopping. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the way he tried to draw me into the back aisle, how he stayed in the aisles with weaker camera angles, and the moment he stepped over that line just to see what I would do. The next day, right before my shift, one of our regular customers came up to the counter. She'd been in the store the night before and had seen him trying to get my attention. She told me she recognized him from another store across town. A worker there had followed the same man toward a back hallway after he did that little "come here" thing. The manager saw enough on the cameras to call the police. The worker quit soon after, and the man was banned from that location. She said she'd thought about stepping in while it was happening, but didn't want to risk escalating anything while I was alone inside. Instead, she went to her car and stayed parked until she saw me lock up and leave. Knowing she sat out there watching made the whole thing feel even stranger. Me under the lights at the counter, him standing outside at the glass, and her sitting in the dark in her car, waiting to see who left first. I told my manager what had happened later that day. They passed the information to the district office and said they would review the footage, especially around the aisles he walked through and the front entrance. He never came back on any of my shifts, but I still pay attention when someone at the far end of the store tries that little "come here" thing instead of walking up to the counter, or when someone lingers at the staff-only line longer than they should. And every now and then, in the last few minutes before closing, I catch myself looking up at the front doors more often than necessary, just to make sure no one is standing on the other side of the glass, waiting to see what I'll do.